I am John Christy, professor of atmospheric science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. We don't play football at my campus. And Alabama's state climatologist. I have served in many climate capacities, including as a lead author of the United Nations IPCC. My research might best be described as building data sets from scratch to advance our understanding of what the climate is doing and why it does what it does. The main point of my testimony is simple. There is no causal link between the elimination of any single project and changes in the global climate. Thus, no individual project should be held up due to climate change concerns. But let me go much, much further. Suppose the United States closed everything and ceased to exist on this day, May 13th, 2015. No people, no cars, no industry, no utilities. Climate models tell us the result of this imaginary scenario in 50 years might be a few hundredths of a degree, an amount smaller than the amount by which the global temperature already bounces around from one month to the next. The impact would be so small as to be unattributable to regulations. This result is well known as described in my written testimony. I have presented similar calculations in federal court that went uncontested. But we should back up a bit and address the presumed causal link between CO2 emissions and climate change. You know, we monitor the climate for such variables as temperature. What we do not have is a direct and observable means to tell us why those changes occur. Our thermometers only tell us what has happened. They do not tell us why it happened. To understand why these changes occur, we use climate models whose equations attempt to contain all of the important factors that affect climate. If they are accurate, we can then see how each factor, such as rising greenhouse gases, affects the climate and whether CO2 would be the cause of the changes we see. As shown in my written testimony and up on the chart here, the models fail the simplest of validation tests. They can't even reproduce what has already happened. All 102 model runs warm up the planet more than has actually occurred in the past 36 years. On average, the warming rate of the atmosphere in these models is 3 times reality. As a consequence, our science has not established the causal link between CO2 emissions and what the climate is actually doing. Therefore, emissions cannot be used as a proxy for climate change. Further, the CEQ guidance gives a list of weather and climate events it claims are increasing due to extra greenhouse gases. But as demonstrated in my written testimony, several of these phenomena have shown no change while CO2 emissions have risen. So there is no proof of a link. This evidence indicates that it has not been established that CO2 emissions have a confident and quantifiable causal link to climate change, whether one is talking about global temperature or about disruptive weather events. Now, it is no secret that the state of Alabama is in a desperate fight with the federal EPA. Our elected officials understand, as do I, their state climatologist, that the regulations being established will do nothing to alter whatever the climate is going to do. We are fighting for our industries, which are being tempted by lower costs in Mexico and China, where their emissions will actually rise. We are fighting for our utilities, which sell over 30% of their electricity production to nearby states who need it. And we're fighting for the many poor people in our state who do not need another hike in their utility bills to satisfy a regulation whose only demonstrable impact will be this further drain on their meager resources. This is a time when even so-called green countries like Germany and Japan are adding to their carbon emissions by building more coal-fired power plants, while the rest of the world is moving forward with affordable carbon-based energy. It simply does not seem to me to be scientifically justifiable or economically rational that this nation should establish regulations whose only discernible consequence is an increase in economic pain visited most directly and harshly on the poorest among us. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Christie, I have a couple questions for you. In your testimony, you state, quote, because changes in the emissions of our entire country would have such a tiny calculated impact on global climate, it is obvious that single projects or even entire sectors of the economy would produce imperceptible impacts, unquote. In light of this, is the CEQ guidance well advised?
Oh, I don't think so. Excuse me. I look at it from a scientific perspective as a working stiff scientist, and the fundamental thing here is that there is no proof that these emissions cause specific things you see in climate. So how can one link a cause to an effect here? Because there is no proof of it. I build those climate data sets. It's not there.
If all of the climate models that Ms. Goldfuss and others do adhere to were correct, are you still saying that a single country or a single project within a country, like a particular electrical generating coal-fired power plant, is going to have an imperceptible, maybe even an immeasurable impact? Is that correct?
That's correct. The emissions globally are so large compared to what a country has or what a single project would have, you would be spitting in the ocean is what you'd be doing.
Thank you. Now, you say in your testimony also that, quote, greenhouse gas emissions cannot be used as a proxy for alleged climate change because our capability to demonstrate how greenhouse gases influence the already observed climate is so poor, unquote. Could you elaborate on that, please?
As I showed in my chart, none of the climate models is able to reproduce the most simple of metrics, the global atmospheric temperature over the past 36 years. This is a period in which we've had satellite information to show and also independent balloon information. What has happened in the real world is not produced by these models that have a greenhouse gas effect in them. So we don't know what the effect of greenhouse gases are to the climate.
Is it scientific for someone to say that a particular climate event, like a drought in the West or fires resulting from a drought, can be attributable to human climate actions?
Well, two quick things. That's not provable. One cannot prove that. And second of all, if you look at the charts I included in the testimony, drought around the world is not increasing. So we have no link in terms of global drought versus global emissions.
What about severe events like hurricanes?
There is no increase in hurricanes. We've monitored them for 150 years. There is no increase in intensity or severity of hurricanes. So there is no link there.
So if someone stands up in Congress, for instance, and says a hurricane was caused by human climate action, is that scientific or not?
That is not scientific.
Okay, thank you. Now, your testimony suggests that climate models are not useful tools for prediction. Why is that, and are there better tools?
Well, the simple answer to that is, can they reproduce the past first? That should be a simple test. Can you reproduce what has already happened? And as I demonstrated in the testimony, the climate models have been unable to reproduce what has actually happened in the past. I would not claim that I would have confidence in them to tell us what would happen in the future.
So what would be a better model?
I think the better model is look at the real world as it's going on. And that's what we do in observational science. I mean, I built my first climate data set when I was 50 years ago, before NEPA. And so we can watch the real world. That will tell us what's going on, and not much is happening, in truth.
Thank you for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to present a question to the entire panel. I just want to get in my mind the magnitude of what we're talking about here in looking at reducing the impact of emissions on global climate change. And how much would the U.S. have to reduce its emissions to have an impact on overall global emissions? And would there be a noticeable impact on the environment if no other nation did the same? In other words, if we were the sole entity to reduce our emissions, what would the total impact be on the conditions that we assert would be affected by this? Sea level rises, the overall average temperature change, plus or minus. Can you give me, panel members, can you give me a perspective on what would happen under that scenario?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So you're saying if we were the only country to address this?
If we were the only country to address it, how much would we have to reduce our emissions in order to have an impact, a noticeable impact on those conditions, sea level and
I can't
temperature?
estimate that number. I apologize.
Okay.
Well, I've done those calculations, Congressman. Our effect would be between 5 and 8 hundredths of a degree. we would not even be able to measure any sea level. The sea level change would be so tiny as to be immeasurable. By the way, sea level has been rising for 20,000 years. It will continue to rise. So no matter what anyone does about their emissions, it will continue to rise. It's not the inch per decade that's the problem. It's that 20 feet in 6 hours from the next hurricane. That's the problem. And that's a different kind of issue to address.
Mr. Christie, I want to ask this. The one purpose of NEPA, as we know, is to increase transparency so we understand the information that's being exchanged in this decision-making process. The draft guidance suggests that agencies incorporate the social cost of carbon into NEPA review documents. Can you tell me, was the social cost of carbon created in a transparent process?
What I know of the social cost of carbon is minimal. I do know it's a black box, and that it is not representative of the science that we really have today. And one of the real shortcomings of the social cost of carbon is it does not consider the real benefits that come when people have access to low-cost energy. And plus some other things. But when you add all those in, you find out burning carbon creates benefits, not costs. But the fundamental climate parameters that are going into that model are that red line I showed you earlier, which is not what's happening in the real world. So immediately the social cost of carbon is giving an erroneous answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the witnesses being here. And I was just curious in considering the kind of questions you've just been asked and the questions that you often get. Professor Christie, you ever feel like Galileo? You remember Galileo? The overwhelming amount of science was against Galileo. And the other scientists got money from the church. They got money from the government for their research in opposing Galileo. And yet Galileo was right, and he had the courage to stand up and say so. I know it's often said by climate fearmongers that, gee, money really dictates the kind of results. I'm curious, is it true you would have access to hundreds of millions of potential grant dollars if you would change your scientific position?
I don't consider myself a Galileo in that sense. No one has arrested me yet.
That's coming.
And it does get personal when you talk about chocolate cake, though. I
Yeah.
wonder about that.
Yeah.
What I see as a real problem in the government is that there is an agenda that has been stated from the top. Climate change is settled science, on and on and on like that. That is a message to everyone in the agencies which have the funding to make sure that happens. We do not see what I would call a red team situation, where if an issue is going to cost the economy so much that you would set aside some funding to say, are there problems with this? Are there independent people, skeptical people that will look and see what might be wrong with it? I am one of the few people that actually builds these climate data sets from scratch so that we can see what the real climate is doing.
Well, I understand you may have a slide that compares the various climate models.
Yes, being
I guess
from
is that it?
Alabama, a lot of target.
Would you explain that?
numbers there. So this is a target. That is the trend in the atmospheric temperature that has happened since 1979. That's the target that you want to hit with your climate model. So it's like we give someone 102 bullets to shoot at that target. Okay, go to the next one. And that's what they got. That not a single one of these climate model projections was able to hit the target. That is the basis, though, on which the policy is being made, is on those climate models, not on the evidence before us.
And that's what we're basing all of these things, all of these rules, all of this massive amount of paper that's produced, reports that are produced, requirements for reports. Let me just tell you, I've got a woman over 80 in my district, lives in a rural area, and she said when I was born and raised, it was in a home where the only energy we had was in our wood-burning stove, and my power is getting more and more expensive, I'm afraid I'm going to die in a home like that. Do you have another slide that shows a difference in what's projected and what's real? Well, this is the one you were showing a while ago.
Yes, that, I think everyone here in this room can understand that slide. And I think they would understand something is wrong with the scientific theory we have about how greenhouse gases affect the climate. No one has said this slide is wrong. It's been available for over 2 years, or over a year. It took me a long time to build it because that's downloading 102 models and so on. But that is the way I understand it. The extreme claims about climate change are based upon what those models, what that red line is showing, and not on what the real world is actually doing.
Yeah. Well, as someone who was shocked and didn't believe all the scientific projections in the 70s that said we're at the beginning of a new ice age, I get a little leery of the new projections that we're headed toward warming this place up to where we're going to have more crops than we've ever had. What a terrible thing. But yes, sir.
Right, yeah. One other thing is I lived in Africa, and so your comment about the wood-burning stove and so on, I can say this without a doubt, that without energy, life is brutal and short. And I witnessed it as someone living in Africa. And to withdraw energy, make it more expensive, to make it inaccessible, that is not that's immoral.
That does more harm to men than anything. I'm on record as believing climate change to be a fact. In East Texas, where I live, it happens 4 times a year.
And in the minute I have left, Dr. Christy, I appreciated your building the data sets from scratch and the slides that we saw. It would be, maybe at another time, it would be interesting to take those slides farther back to 1950, 1900, 1850, and not just compare what the IPCC scientists have projected the difference in temperature would be over a 5-year period of time, but look at the temperature and look at the J curve on the greenhouse gas emissions and see how they align. And I'm sure you've worked on things like that too, but this is where the 97% of the climate scientists come down on believing that climate change is something that's real and that we have to deal with. Dr. Christy.
Okay, I would hope I could disabuse you of that 97% number. That's been debunked in several studies, so that's just not
I was
real.
just quoting my colleague. So.
Yeah. Well, remember, the NASA website is controlled by a specific,
We're quoting
specific
NASA.
government.
Yeah.
The key about the diagram I showed is when are the greenhouse gases supposed to be most evident in terms of the response of the climate system? It's the last 36 years. That's the time period you need to study and see, because that's where the response is measurable according to climate models. We can hardly measure much of a temperature increase in that time, as you saw on the chart. So that's why you want this period, because this is when greenhouse gases, the increasing greenhouse gases, would be affecting the climate the most.
But Professor Christy, enlighten us on this whole issue. What is the science and what is this 97%? My understanding about the 97%, it's often quoted that this is consensus rather than true settled science, is that this was 97% of colleagues who were asked the question. And certainly you're going to get any outcome you want as long as you ask the people that you choose to ask.
There were many failings with that study that came up with the 97%. One was how the sample was chosen.
Right.
Who did the decision about whether someone came on one side or the other. That was one of the problems with that. But when it comes to scientific method, I'm right with you. If we think we understand a system, then we have to be able to predict it. If we can't predict it, we don't understand it.
Yes.
The climate is clearly something we can't predict. Therefore, there is something very fundamental about the system we do not understand, as I've shown in the charts. And I think we have a long way to go.
Absolutely. So you show very clearly there that out of 102 different models, not a single one of them even comes close, it appears, to being accurate in predictability.
Yes, that's That should concern everyone in this committee.
Absolutely. So now we have tremendous amount of policy coming out of our government, out of governments around the world. And by the way, I believe it's Australia that actually repealed their cap and trade tax. So some of them, I think, are getting smart and actually looking at the science. So after all of these years and all of this policy and now cost to government and to free enterprise, to private businesses and individuals, we actually find out that all of that policy is based on what perhaps one could say is voodoo science. What would you say?
Well, I'd say the policy is based upon some theory that needs a whole lot of correction to it. But also, you should look at the numbers, too, about carbon emissions and coal burning and so on. No one is following the United States on this. Emissions are rising. I mentioned Germany and Japan. Their emissions are rising. They're building more coal-fired power plants. So no one really is following us. Look at the numbers. They will tell you the truth.
Well, what about this social cost thing now that's coming up, the social cost of carbon, and it was calculated. How was that number, how is that number calculated?
Now we're talking about voodoo, I think. But I'm familiar more with the inputs that are on the climate side. If the climate does this, I think it's basically the global temperature does this, then all these other factors are supposed to happen and theoretically happen. That's fundamentally the wrong input, because I've shown you that the input that is just based on the global temperature is already off by a good bit. So any of those downstream effects the social cost of carbon determines are going to be off.
So there's no way to truly calculate the offsetting taxation necessary in order to improve the climate outcomes when we first don't have the science, or the predictable science, in place to begin with.
Yeah, you're talking about an economic question. I
Yes.
probably am not an expert at all on that, but I would say since you start with a false or an erroneous input, you're not going to get a good answer at the end,
Right.
no matter what else you do on the other
You
side.
basically have to make a number up and extrapolate from there, then, is what you're saying, in order to come up with any number, because you don't really have the science to prove what you can do economically with taxes and regulations that are actually going to mitigate climate change.
Right. We can test some of these things as I've done. Okay, let's shut down the United States. What would that
Right.
effect be? So there are tests like that we can do, and they all show that these regulations and intents will just do nothing to whatever the climate's going to do.
Well, it just certainly appears to me that before we continue down this road, Mr. Chairman, of taxing individuals, taxing businesses, taxing our economy, and hyper-regulating our economy, killing jobs, flattening our economy even more than it is today, we should actually get the science right. With that, I'll yield back.
I think you said that thermometers say that temperatures have gone up, but they don't say why. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the thermometers tell us what has happened. They don't tell us why.
So you do not believe that, as I say, that there is this causal link. We have not proven this causal link.
Yeah, what I believe is irrelevant. I am just looking at data, the output from the theory and the output from the real world. They don't match.
I got it. Then you went on to say, though, in response to a question from my esteemed colleague, Mr. Whitman, that you know exactly how much less the Earth would warm if the U.S. stopped emitting all of its greenhouse gases. So on one hand, you say there's no causal connection between greenhouse gases and the warming. And then you say in the same hearing, you can definitely predict the exact future warming due to less greenhouse gases. How do you reconcile this?
I think if you listen to what I said, Congressman, I said if you use the climate models, this is what they tell us.
So you do not believe in that climate model at all?
What I believe is irrelevant.
I'm asking you a question.
I look at the
told us
information there.
You told us exactly how much there would be less greenhouse warming.
I use the climate models, the Magic C model, which is the IPCC-approved model, to demonstrate what they would say.
So you pick and choose when you use that model by saying to us that it does not occur.
Unlike my colleague from Texas that said the Four Seasons, climate change has been happening without man for forever. Geology tells us that. Would you not agree, Dr. Christie?
Oh, yes, and especially about the droughts in California. That's where I started building my data sets as a native of California. And it turns out that California has experienced droughts hundreds of years long, not just 4.
Well, just from your perspective, how large would a project really have to be before it would have a direct impact on the environment or a climate change?
Well, as we calculated the number, the project would have to be bigger than the entire economy of the United States of America.
So it's not going to happen, in your opinion?
In my opinion, that would not happen. I hope it doesn't happen.
All right. Well, and then you add into the equation no ability for us to control foreign governments when it comes to them being involved with these environmental policies. You know, what in the world would we have to do to have a significant impact on climate change?
The climate is always going to be changing. Right now, it looks like the effect of the enhanced greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere is pretty minor and difficult to even extract from the way the natural climate system works. I just look at numbers when we talk about the evidence here, and I don't see anything happening in the rest of the world that's going to change their means of getting energy, because carbon-based energy is the energy that powers the world. It lifts people out of poverty. That's not going to stop, no matter what the United States does.
Well, you have created a computer program that creates weather simulations. Is that correct?
Not right now, no. I take output from computer models.
Okay, you take out from computer model. How long has that been taking place, these models?
The modeling really has gone on for 50 years for these global climate models. They're very expensive now. They're very complicated. I can't see a lot of improvement, though, in their
Have they been peer reviewed?
Oh, yes, they are peer reviewed quite often.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Weather is different than climate. Is climate definable in the absolute or the historic?
We have all kinds of information about what has happened in the past, so we have some sense about where we are at the present and what changes are, how they relate to the past.
Well, I think many people, when they talk about climate, they actually think of weather, so that when it was raining back when I was back in Utah and it was sunny here in the 80s, and my friends were sending me pictures of them at the beach and I was upset about it, that's not the same thing.
I think one of the real problems here is that weather events that get so much attention because of video availability and so on are somehow linked to this global climate change movement, when droughts, floods, all these things have always been going on.